thank you very much. I didn't come such a long way after I came from Bonn. So, but I don't know, maybe it's a long way. But from another seminar on research ethics. So I'm here more in my capacity as a member of the ALLEA Permanent Working Group on research ethics. And I was member of the drafting group behind the revised edition of the European Code of Conduct. And that's what I have been asked to talk about. So thank you very much for this invitation. I'm very happy to be here. It's a great honor. And as I said, it's been a hectic start of the year. I mean, Bonn had this 3-day meeting, the Printer project on research integrity, and before that last week there was a meeting in Brussels on open science and also related to ethical issues and open access. So you could say that I'm beginning to feel some sort of tournament fatigue, but I hope I can still interest you in this. How do you move on with this? You press. Oh, sorry. Yes, so if you first think of what is the purpose of the European Code of Conduct for Research Integrity. So it is a code for the research community, and it describes the principles behind good and responsible research practices. It describes why responsible behavior makes sense and why we can't do science or do research if we don't have the right type of mindset for it. And who is it for? It's for individual researchers, obviously, but there's a lot of emphasis this time also on research groups, research leaders, research performing institutions, institutional responsibilities, and research funders. What is not there is political decision makers and research deciding on the criteria to be used in research performance assessments. And that, of course, we did discuss it, but we didn't know how to, we couldn't really formulate it into the code. But I'll get back to this later. And where does this code come from? It's a revised edition of the original code from 2011. It was produced together with fairly big working groups from ALLEA and the European Science Foundation. And because the European Science Foundation does no longer exist, ALLEA was the sole owner at this stage of the code. And it was the initiative came from the European Commission, asked ALLEA to make a revision of the code, to turn it into more like a code of conduct, a guidelines document. The EU didn't didn't interfere in any way with the process as such. It helped to organize a stakeholder consultation process it was last year. So actually this code is about a year old now. And the code is firmly based on the idea of self-regulation of the research community. I'll come back to that as later. So what was wrong with the first version of the code? Nothing wrong as such, but it was not a code of conduct. It was more like a sermon. It was, I would say that it was produced at the stage when the main emphasis was on emphasizing or trying to persuade the research community, decision makers, to believe that research integrity is important. So this time when we started revising the code, we took that for granted, that it is important. And what is its status now? It was approved first by ALLEA and then distributed to the member academies, but then it was endorsed by the EU Commission as the reference document for the Horizon 2020 calls. And that gives it a very strong status. And the Commission has organized its translation into all official European EU languages. This is still an ongoing process. In this, I think actually 2 have been, I mean, they've been translated, but they need to be checked that they comply with the national, well, I would say terminological problems occur. So they will be translated or finalized. And it was presented at the World Conference of Research Integrity last year, and it was very well received. And as you can say, it's available here in this house, and I know that there's some copies available if you haven't got them, also on the desk out there. But we are in the heart of the organization here. This just shows that how it was promoted by the EU, by the Commissioner, by sort of many speakers, and that, of course, has given it promoted its dissemination and its status. What was interesting was that when the first code was published, first version was published just before that, EU wasn't interested in research integrity. There was hardly anything. They didn't think it was their business. But now it's very much their business. And that's why there are very many projects related to research integrity at the moment in Europe. These are just a few. I mean, there are lots more on the ENERI project ongoing, the Printager project, and the RRI, which is Responsible Research and Innovation. And so there's a project on training and capacity building. Printager is mission to enhance research integrity by promoting research culture. And then the RRI project looked at the barriers to the process. And as Nicole Berger has been asking questions here, she's the former chair. Is that correct, Nicole? So you're still chair of ENRIO, the European Network of Research Integrity Offices. And they are currently, ENRIO is currently working on the problems related to whistleblower protection and also related to defining what a whistleblower is. So as I said, it's been a hectic start of the year, and these issues were discussed just within the last 2 weeks. And the last thing was this Printager consensus statement that was arrived at yesterday. So, but it's still in process. But I'll come back to them at just to tell what the main findings maybe are. We'll get back to the code. So how normative is this code? How long is it valid for? It is a framework document. We heard 2 talks about the implementation and cases. This is a framework document. And it reflects the views of the research community of what responsible conduct of research entails. So it's about our mindsets, what they should be like. It allows for national, local differences and implementations into national and institutional codes. And it is intended to be a living document. In other words, it can be updated at regular intervals. We've been thinking of a 3-year interval because obviously more must be said about open science, open data, and open access in the future. But at the moment, it's still very, there's a lot of discussion, but no clear guidelines. And who does the code apply to, or who could benefit from it? Certainly all researchers, peers, seniors, juniors, research groups, the whole community, because it's an empowering document. You can see that what is considered to be right and what is considered not to be right or unacceptable. So you can refer to the documents as say that, like what in the previous case, what has been done is not right, it's not acceptable. So there must be procedures in place to deal with cases like that. It also is, I think it's very, very useful for institutional decision makers, because I think the main message when we try to change or develop research culture is to make institutional leaders aware of the fact that cover-ups are not the way to go, but to understand that research integrity is part of the quality culture, quality assurance of the institution. So it's on the contrary, it's a good thing if you reveal misconduct cases. And funding organizations, as we heard. Quality assurance and also responsible use of public finances. So the principles that we then ended up with, I mean, there are many ways of dividing this continuum, but the 5 principles: reliability, honesty, respect for colleagues, which these days is one of the key issues if you think of publication practices and problems that fierce competition leads to. And accountability, from idea to publication and its management. Accountability for training at the institutional level and so on, mentoring. One aspect that is widely ignored, I think, in many institutions. So where is the focus? On good research practices. And good research practices in the research environment, in training, in using complying with regulations, the safeguards, data practices and management, and this of course is a very current issue, to follow the FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable, putting these into practice. Collaborative working, more important than ever. All partners take responsibility for the integrity, and publication dissemination practices. So what then does the code say about violations of research integrity? It relies on the old definitions of misconduct proper, if you want to put it that way, the FFP, fabrication, falsification, of plagiarism. And it describes, in general terms, how to deal with violations, what the procedures should be in place in different ways, in different contexts. It deals with the consistency and confidentiality of investigations, whistleblower protection, which is a big issue, transparency of procedures, but sanctions are described at national or institutional codes. So this is not a sanctions-oriented code of conduct. And what is really important is that fairness to all parties in an investigation. So you're not guilty before you found out to be guilty. And this is a big problem because these accusations often live on, although the researcher has been acquitted. Then we have FFP, and then we decided on to call the rest unacceptable practices, and not call them minor misdemeanors or questionable practices, because quite simply they are unacceptable practices, whether they're sanctioned or not, because this is not a sanctions-oriented document. So, but it's difficult to define unacceptable practices, so we decided on giving examples. I mean, it's an open list. Some are more serious than others, as you heard, and there are different sanctions than at the institutional level. The last one, allowing funders to jeopardize independence in the research process of reporting of results so as to further bias. That was something that was added by the request of the industrial stakeholders, as a private sector stakeholders. This has been a bit controversial, but fair enough. I mean, this happens, it takes place. You know, you're supposed to show that in a pharmaceutical company that their stuff works. Further examples of unacceptable practices. And we all know that these sort of expanding the bibliography or misrepresenting research achievements all depend on the way research performance is measured. I will not go through them, but we have the establishing of supporting journals that undermine the quality control of research, and that gets us to the open access publication practices, whose responsibilities, I suppose, is a whole research community's responsibility and institutional responsibility to go through the list of journals. It has heard many examples of particular, I would say, emerging European research cultures, particularly in Eastern Europe, where you have introduced, the government says that publish in a referee journal in English, you get money for that. And so we heard, I've heard a couple of talks that say that, I don't want to mention where, but how this policy has meant that all researchers now try to publish in these predatory journals, because that's the easiest way to publish, so don't check on that. So I already did comment on this, why we chose the term unacceptable practices, because how we see it, the code, in their most serious forms, unacceptable practices are sanctionable. But at the very least, every effort should be made to prevent them through training and supervision and mentoring. So to develop a positive and supportive research environment. So what about sanctions? The philosophy is based on self-regulation. So, but you need to have a system to monitor allegations of misconduct. There must be clear procedures in place. And we have to remember that sanctions depend on the status of the offender. But the sanctions are usually, in most cases, issued by the university or the research organization. This is often misunderstood by those instigators of the allegations who want to have severe punishments and think that, because misconduct is in some, included in the criminal law in some context in some countries like Norway. It's not in Finland. It's, so if you're really angry at somebody, you want them to hang if they've caught out. But this doesn't go to law court, unless, of course, there's misappropriation of funds and other things. So then it's a parallel investigation. So what about trust? Trust in research is essential. And we have to remember that the vast majority of researchers are or want to be honest. That's the starting point. It is the basis of whole self-regulation. But we also know that offenders can get away if suspicions are not voiced in the community. We heard an example here how difficult it is to voice your suspicions. If credentials are trusted without checking, false medical diplomas, for example, there were a few cases in Finland a few years ago. So I would formulate it as trust is essential, but so is healthy mistrust. So if somebody writes 50 articles, refereed journals a year, there's a lot of room for healthy mistrust to see where these So how does self-regulation work? It needs to be monitored, it needs to be promoted. So I would emphasize the fact that research integrity is an integral part of any institution's quality assurance system. So national level guidelines and monitoring are probably the best tool. So if there's a reporting system or if there's that you know what the national situation is. Of course, this is a very different situation in a country like Finland or Germany. Because monitoring only at institutional level may lead to cover-ups or leads to cover-ups and shady practices, and often is based on misunderstood collegiality. So what could the impact of this code be? I would say that the code is a checklist for national and institutional guidelines. It can go more detailed in more detail into processes and so. And the national level formulations will depend on the legal status of research integrity. So the code could lead to kind of soft harmonization at European level, a common understanding what research integrity entails. Political responsibility, I think this is a big question. So who carries the political responsibility? Bodies making science political decisions about performance criteria. At the national level, it's often ministries of education and funding organization. EU, of course, is a major driver in this respect. So questions we could ask, or should ask, and ask, are how is it possible that predominantly quantitative criteria can be used to measure quality? Do the metrics used really encourage researchers to adopt novel and interdisciplinary approaches? Do the quantitative criteria encourage to engage in curiosity-driven research and so on? And do the funding criteria really allow researchers to define their own research questions? And do the funding criteria take into account that it takes time to do good research? And these questions are being asked now, and the voices are getting louder. So, for example, the Open Data seminar in Brussels. So what came out of that sort of statements is that promote implementation of the FAIR principles, although they were still fairly pessimistic, say that if by 2025 two fair principles are implemented, that's a good result. So open data is still very much in the air. But invest in the certification and stewardship of data management, which is of course a big issue, and the management and the repositories. Invest in training. Training came up many times. And motivate researchers to provide open data by using fairer reward systems. Help to change the current research culture. And about open access. Take back the main emphasis to peer reviews, renew the peer review system, use the possibilities that digitalization, crowdsourcing might offer. Redefine the concept of publication to include open data. Use reliable open access journal directories, for example, the Directory of Open Access Journals, the DOAJ. And return performance assessment to researchers and scholarly associations from the commercial providers. In other words, stop counting, start reading. What the Printer meeting, the consensus statement is about, they had involved some people external to the Printer process program or project like me, but the idea was to provide guidelines to research institutions and all research performing institutions to help these organizations to put into practice research integrity guidelines by describing the type of procedures, structures, functions, procedures you need to have in place at institutional level. Although you agreed to follow these guidelines, but you need to have a system, in-house system, to make it work. And this is what the contents of this consensus statement will include, and that will appear very soon, because we reached an agreement about 3 o'clock yesterday on that. So that was the end of my talk. Thank you very much.
Hartwig Schlüter from Göttingen. I think we have a big problem in society concerning research integrity. For example, if a PhD is working for a ministry and the politicians ask him to do something, or something is the politician wants to, but the researcher has to say, okay, this is science, but it's not true science. And I think we need a place where we can go to solve these problems. This is really a big problem because in German courts, for example, when a judge talks about science, sometimes he has no idea about the science he's talking about. And I don't know how we can solve it now, but it's because it's a big problem, but we need a procedure, and we need a place where we can go to solve these discussions. For example, only what that is for me, I work in the field of renewable energy, and this is in conflict with nature and animals, and this is a very emotional problem. But when we work out emotionally, we cannot solve it. So we are interested to solve problems and not to make big emotions.
I agree with you. This is it is a big issue, and there's a so-called sort of SAPEA project now going on in Europe, where also ALLEA is a partner, and the idea science advice for what was the PEA. I mean, Robert is here somewhere, so you remember what the rest of the letters stand for. But the idea is to provide sound advice that has been discussed and worked on among researchers. The problem, of course, is that researchers don't agree, and if there are many sort of hesitations about recommendations and things. But on the other hand, you're absolutely right, because then what politicians, at least in Finland, tend to do these days, they resort to consultancy that writes a report that looks like a scientific report that usually or normally promotes the ideas of the particular political movement or the government or whatever, and it's not based on any sort of consensus or discussion among the specialists. But fake news is everywhere.
So Kaspar Ehlers from Legal History Institute of Max Planck Society in Frankfurt. You mentioned a very important point in one of the first slides. That was self-regulation. And I think that's one of the most important things we have to talk about here, is because when you go with scientific fraud is not a wording from German law, and things went to court, it's very difficult because there are not quite appropriate laws. There are no people at the court as judges which were able to deal with the problems, not to speak about the scientific background. And so it's very important that we can keep these things firstly in our community. But the things went ugly wrong, or will go ugly wrong when the community is infected. And so these spheres which were going in together of political interest, economical interest, scientific interest, and people which were easily to seduce for misconduct, that's a very big thing. And I think, and I thank for these European initiatives, but every one of us in the institutes, wherever he is or she is forced to keep an eye on this outside world, which we were paid off and which we are responsible for. And so I would like to ask, and it could be tomorrow in the work groups, and point at what is where is the point where we have to go to court or to the officials, like in the very interesting presentation that comes before yours. Thank you.
So I can't answer that. The second part, but yes, definitely it is up to the research community to define the mindset of researchers, what is correct. So in that sense, the ALLEA Code, of course, is aspirational. It's written for the ideal world, but I don't think it should have been written for the real world.